The world's on fire. Our river's gone dry. The rich are getting richer. They've left us out here to die. Mass migration. We got no place to hide. Who's against us? Who's on our side? Are they too dumb or are they just in on it? Liars and cheaters, a red-hot grip. Ditch the gaslighting gas bag that speaks in code. He's a faker, a shaker, a pontificating pantload. In this house of mirrors, we've hit the wall before it's too late. Let's go. Come on, y'all. It's border to border and coast to coast. It's real, it's facts, and it ain't no hoax. It's Podcast by George, and it's showtime, folks. Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on into another podcast by George. I love that intro. That's a new one. I kind of keep a series of them in rotation so people don't get completely sick of them. We won't play that one all the time. It's very dramatic, obviously, but if you got an opinion on it, please let me know. But I kind of like it at least once in a while, anyway. And before we get going here, I wanted to do a little housekeeping. Bring this up on screen. I promised a viewer that I would talk about this very briefly at the next show, and this is our opportunity. Robert Redford had a birthday this past week. I think a guy turned 86 years old. This is a meme that was on Facebook. It says the environment should be put in the category of our national security. Defense of our resources is just as important as defense abroad. Otherwise, what is there to defend? Very well put, Robert. And the story that I promised to tell, I was a cub reporter, basically, not long out of college, many years ago. We're talking late 70s, folks. That's how old I am. And he was in a press conference, a presser in a cornfield here in Iowa. He'd come down from the mountaintops of Colorado to talk about the environment and about farming practices. I mean, he was on the cutting edge, the early part of this. And I thought, well, okay, I got to get a really good question in. So I, sweated bullets and came up with this question. My question basically was, as a Hollywood actor and an environmentalist, really, what qualifies you to come to Iowa and talk to Iowa farmers about farming practices? And that basically was the question that I posed. But also in the gaggle of reporters was George Mills. And folks may remember, some of the older viewers may remember, he was a big time newspaper reporter. He was with the Des Moines Register. He covered the State House for many years. He wound up his career on television, which is kind of circuitous, but he was on WHO. And he was there. And I thought, well, I've got to defer to George here. I mean, he's the dean. And I also thought, I want to see what he asked Robert Redford. So, because I had my little question ready to go, and the press conference started, and George Mills was first to pose a question. Redford looked out at him, and he said, "Mr. Redford, what's your favorite movie?" And I mean, I about fell over. I like, what the hell? You're going to talk to the guy about his movies? And Redford kind of looked at him, flummoxed a little bit, and he says, "Well, do you mean that I've acted in, or that I've ever seen, or that I've directed?" And I thought, oh boy, George is losing it. And I eventually got to ask my question. I've got it on tape somewhere. Maybe I'll play it someday. But George Mills was asking the question, maybe the right question. And it was kind of the same question that I wanted to ask, but differently, maybe less confrontational. But the point is, that's really what Robert Redford was qualified to talk about. And maybe that was Mills' way of kind of presenting it. I don't know, but rest in peace, George Mills. That's the story. And so I promised that I would say that, but let's get on to our topic today. Let's get to our guest, folks. It's Dr. Alex S. Vitale. He's professor of sociology and coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College and the City University of New York Graduate Center. He's a visiting professor at London South Bank University. And I'm going to read the long form bio here because it's his first time on. When he comes on again, and I hope he does, we'll shorten it up. He spent the last 30 years writing about policing and consults both police departments and human rights organizations internationally. Professor Vitale is the author of City of Disorder, How the Quality of Life campaign transformed New York politics, and The End of Policing. His academic writings on policing have appeared in Policing in Society, Police Practice and Research, Mobilization, and Contemporary Sociology. He's also a frequent essayist whose writings have been published. Get this now, listen to this list: the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, the Nation, Vice, News, Fortune, and USA Today, as well as Truth Out. We're going to be bringing that up on screen here shortly. He's also appeared on CNN, MSNBC, CNBC, NPR, PBS, Democracy Now!, and where I most recently saw him, and The Daily Show with Trevor Noah. And now he's on Podcast by George. And, I just couldn't be happier about having him on the show. Let's welcome Dr. Vitale to the show.
Hi, George. Hi, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. Now, I think of Dick Vitale. Vitale, is that the pronunciation that I should be using?
Vitale, yeah, Vitale.
Okay,
that was
Vitale.
fine. Great.
All right, great. Well, let's start off with some really bad news, some really horrific news here. I almost don't like to play this. I know you've probably seen it on loop over the past several days, but for my viewers that may not have seen it, but just as a means of getting us going here, let's play this. Okay, so that's that's the bad news. That's the horrific news, really. I mean, it's kind of hard to believe, considering what's been in the news and what's been happening in the past several years, that this same thing can transpire this way. Now, I want to bring this up on screen because this is the good news, if there is any good news. This is the guy after he got out of jail, and he appears to be, some worse for wear, but he appears to be all right. I'll read this recount from the Associated Press, and we'll talk to the doc. Federal authorities said Monday they have started a civil rights investigation following the suspension of 3 Arkansas law enforcement officers after a video posted on social media showed 2 of them beating a man while a 3rd officer held him on the ground. That's what we just saw now. The officers were responding to a report of a man making threats. I mean, it was crazy train stuff, but it's outside a convenience store Sunday in the small town of Mulberry. It's about 140 miles northwest of Little Rock. Now, when I read the article, Doc, I highlighted that portion. It seems rather innocuous, but I thought, why did they identify this as 140 miles northwest of Little Rock? That's about as far from Little Rock as you can get. It's not a state that a lot of people maybe are familiar with. Maybe they only know about Little Rock, but it actually is up in the corner up by Fort Smith. But if you remember, and I talk about this on my show all the time, and you're an essayist, you're a writer, you know this better than most. Every word means something. Well, there's a civil rights investigation underway. And of course, Little Rock is famous in the annals of American history on the civil rights issue. I don't know if that's why they put it this way or not, but I thought that was an interesting little footnote to this. Now, the FBI and the Arkansas State Police will collect all available evidence and will ensure that the investigation is conducted in a fair, thorough, and impartial manner, the Justice Department said in a statement. The federal investigation is separate and independent from the ongoing state investigation. Now, remember that. I'm going to come right back to it. Crawford County Sheriff Jim Duante said before Worcester was arrested, that's the guy that we saw on the ground, an officer asked if he had any weapons on him, and he handed over the a weapon to the officer. Duante didn't specify what type of weapon. Okay, Doc, the reason I highlighted that segment right there up above about the federal investigation is separate. That traditionally has kind of been thought of as good news, particularly in liberal circles, to have a federal investigative agency of some type to oversee, like Arkansas. And I'm going back to the civil rights era in particular. Do you think that's still the case, or has that changed so much that that's no longer relevant?
Well, I think it's relevant in the sense that, some of these small towns, the political establishment in these small towns is laser focused on defending what the police do, and that means that it's very hard to get any kind of real investigation. Now, they've called in the Arkansas State Police, but I'm not sure that's a huge improvement in this regard. But having said all that, these independent investigations don't tend to produce results that are meaningful or that feed back into better policing. So it's possible that at the end of all these investigations, there will be some consequences, negative consequences for one or more of these officers. But I think it's unlikely to change the basic way that policing is conducted in that area, 140 miles northwest of Little Rock.
And we're going to talk about this a little bit more. Dr. Vitale and I are just getting acquainted, just like our viewers are. My background, I was a police and fire reporter. I used to go through the police blotter, go through the reports back in the day. And some people would be shocked that this type of thing could ever happen. But here's my take on it, based on my experience in reading these accounts and reporting on these types of stories. If you run, you're going to get your ass whooped, at least if they catch you. They do not like people running from them. If they've got to run, man, they don't like that. And if you resist in the way that one of them is struck or something like that, oh my God, you're going to be lucky to make it through this. And if you produce a weapon, which this guy did, all rules are off. I mean, you're going to have something happen like what happened there on the ground. That's the way that it's always been. I can't believe that it's still that way, but recent history seems to tell us that it is, Doc.
Yeah, I think you're basically right about that. I don't think running from them was a factor here, and I'm not sure that the weapon was either, but I think we probably had some form of contempt of cop or some kind of active resistance underway. And just to remind people, right, that's what led to the death of Eric Garner in New York. That's what led to the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, right? Over very, very minor things, which it appears to be the case here, right? It was not the underlying offense that somehow warranted this incredible use of police violence. It was the refusal to cooperate with the police, what we sometimes refer to as being guilty of contempt of cop. And then if you look at the charges that were put on him, this also is very reminiscent of a contempt of cop type scenario where they load on a whole set of charges that had nothing to do with the original encounter, the original call to 911, but are there in essence to justify the high level of violence used by the police.
And there are some alternatives to this. And we're going to get into that because it's in your Truth Out article, which I really like, because I bitch and complain with the best of them on my podcast. And oftentimes I'm accused of not having any solution. But you've got some that might have mitigated this particular circumstance. How much, when you look at this, and maybe we're getting in areas that we shouldn't. I mean, I'm not a psychologist or anything like this, but and I remember this when I was looking at the George Floyd incident. How much of this is police brutality in the traditional sense, contempt of cop, which you mentioned? They want people to obey them. They want to set a precedent. They do not want people doing this. Obviously, that probably is a factor in this. But something that people don't talk about very much at all is fear. I think they're afraid that somebody, particularly if they think they might be under the influence of a substance, is going to get up off the ground and whoop their ass. In the George Floyd incident, I'm not so sure that wasn't a little bit of what was going on there. Do you see any of that, or am I kind of off on the outer fringe here a little?
Well, look, in both these cases, we have multiple officers present. And so I think yes, there are certainly times when officers fear violence blowing back on them, and that may, motivate them to use high levels of force. I think, that when we look closely at the video, right, when police are encountering someone and there's resistance and they have some lawful basis to make an arrest, then we might expect to see some level of violence, some punching, et cetera, to get the person to comply, to put their hands behind their back, etc. Now, there's some question about the utility of this, because when you start punching someone in the face, they're going to want to put their hands in front of their face to stop the punching, not behind their back. But then on top of that, which we could potentially, at least in a legal sense, be justified, there's the slamming his head into the ground when there are already 3 officers on top of him. Yeah. And that's the level of violence, I think, that even the person filming it, you can see how the whole tenor of her reaction to what's happening changes after the head slamming begins. And I think that's the reaction that the general public is having to the video. And that looks like just straight up retributive violence to punish someone for resisting the police rather than using force to effect a lawful arrest.
You bring up an interesting point. That was another takeaway that I had. It was obvious to the bystanders, the person taking the video, which I got from Twitter, by the way, that this was wrong, that this was over the top, that this was out of control. And I think, well, particularly in view of the George Floyd situation and everything that's been going on in this country, why in the hell would the cops not realize that? Is this adrenaline? Did they just lose it? Have they just lost their minds when they get into a physical confrontation, or do they just not care? And this is the way that it's always been. And unless we change things dramatically, this is the way it's always going to be.
Well, look, there's nothing particularly unique about this incident. We see this happen over and over again. Let's go back to Rodney King.
Yes.
What was he guilty of? Speeding. But really, what happened was he resisted police authority, and so they made a lesson of him. Not, in that case, not realizing they were being filmed. But increasingly, what we see is that even when officers know they're being filmed, they engage in this behavior.
Yeah.
And I think part of this is that, we have a culture of impunity within policing that is, justified. Fewer than 1% of officers are convicted of on-the-job killing of people. It's just extremely, extremely rare that officers suffer any meaningful consequences for on-the-job violence. But there's a kind of bigger issue here, right? Which is just, once we get police involved in a scenario, we are opening ourselves up to the prospect of violence. Police are violence workers. That's what distinguishes them from other government workers, is the authorization and capacity to use violence. And that's why I think a lot of people are saying, when they look at situations like this, is what can we do so that we don't have police involved in these scenarios in the first place? Could there have been some other kind of response to this? Eric Garner was selling loose cigarettes, which is like a tax violation at worst. Why were 8 armed police sent to control him, resulting ultimately in his death?
Excellent point. And again, I look at that and think, oh, Eric Garner was another big guy. I mean, I don't know. It's like they are terrified that this guy is going to turn the tables on them. And if they think there's a weapon anywhere involved or anywhere near, they just seem to lose their minds. And I don't know what kind of weapon this guy had, but we got to move off of that case. That's really just the most topical, the most recent thing that popped up in the news. Unbelievably. What we wanted to talk about here today was on the federal level. And again, it's topical news. And it has to do with Mar-a-Lago and Donald Trump and the strange bedfellows, I guess. Dr. Vitale would be the way that I would describe it best, between Republicans and Democrats, the left and the right, liberals, progressives, and conservatives. But you wrote this article entitled, "There Are Good Reasons to Defund the FBI." And those reasons, they have nothing to do with Trump. I'll read into this a little bit, and then we'll get your comments. This week, the FBI took the unprecedented step of executing a search warrant on the Mar-a-Lago home of former President Donald Trump. No former president has ever been the subject of such an investigative practice. In response, Chief Trump supporter and MAGA cheerleader Marjorie Taylor Greene, and God, I'm just like everybody else on my side of the political spectrum, which is left. I mean, that's cringeworthy stuff. But, the doc's going to make an interesting point here, and I've been thinking about this myself. She expressed outrage at the FBI's actions by tweeting, "Defund the FBI." Far-right Representative Paul Gosar hit similar notes, tweeting, "We must destroy the FBI. we must save America. Well, okay. I read that, and I go back to my own humble beginnings back in the 60s and 70s. The anti-war movement was well underway back then. There were no friends of the FBI in my age group because of what we were encountering, both on anti-war and civil rights issues. And now I'm looking at Marjorie Taylor Greene, for God's sake, and she's echoing these same type of sentiments. But there are blue, no matter who people that would say, don't listen to anything she says. I mean, we don't want to do anything that Marjorie Taylor Greene would say. But I'm looking at it thinking, well, you're never going to change her mind on politics, as an example, but you might be able to get a policy changed or a program changed by collaborating with people like her in some ways. Is that kind of the way that you're looking at it?
Well, not exactly. Not exactly. I view this more as a kind of rhetorical opening. I don't think in practice there is grounds for trying to, reach across the aisle to Marjorie Taylor Greene to craft some kind of workable bill around the FBI. I mean, we have totally different objectives here. I think that, there's so much intellectual and ideological confusion on the right about this. It led to scenes like on January 6th of people with thin blue line back the blue flags beating police officers on the Capitol steps, right?
Yeah.
So they don't really, when they think about law enforcement, they think about law enforcement in the service of a certain kind of right-wing agenda. That law enforcement is something that is used against other people, not them. And if it's used against them, then somehow it's fundamentally illegitimate. And Marjorie Taylor Greene doesn't really want to get rid of the FBI. What she wants to do is replace the leadership with right-wing ideologues like herself, so that it can go after Antifa and Black Lives Matter folks.
Mm-hmm.
She just really wants to change up the mission to make it even more conservative, more right wing. And I'll point out the FBI is already, targeting those groups. So it is hilarious, though, to me that they would use defund as the framework for saying that after having spent the last 2 years demonizing Black Lives Matter activists and others for saying, hey, we need to think about the overuse of law enforcement throughout our society.
Let me go back to this article. I want to pick, because I really like this. So pick up some of this here. As you write, while this about face on back the blue is an amusing example of the right-wing ideological confusion that ensues when lawmakers adhere to diehard Trump loyalism, we on the left should use this moment as an opportunity to explore a plan to actually do that. The FBI should indeed be defunded. And of course, that has to do with the definition of defunded. Talk about that very briefly, Doc, because I catch that a lot. People think that, that term came out, defund the police, and everybody thought, oh my God, anarchy. Everybody just wants to tear down the police stations and run amok in the streets. But that's not really, at least what the good definition of defunding means.
Yeah. Well, I heard there was this magical switch somewhere in Washington that if we could just find it and flip it off, that all police would just disappear.
Yeah.
And then we'll just sort of figure out what happens after that.
Yeah.
So, of course, this is ridiculous, right? There is no mechanism for eliminating police in some short, no city council is going to zero out the police budget because of a Black Lives Matter protest, right? What people are calling for in a very concrete way that pre-existed the death of George Floyd was that too many cities have over-prioritized law enforcement at the expense of almost everything else. We've got these cities, 30, 40, 45, 50% of the budget is going to police. And then the community is told, no, you can't have an after-school program for kids. No, we can't have a rape crisis center. No, we can't have a domestic violence shelter. No, we can't have a jobs program. We can't have affordable housing because the whole budget is going into law enforcement. So people weren't really using this phrase defund the police. People were talking about invest, divest, justice reinvestment, shifting priorities, etc. And so when we talk about defunding the FBI, what we're talking about is let's start dismantling it piece by piece, and let's think concretely about the things that it does and whether or not it's a good idea. And so what I tried to do in the article, and maybe we'll talk more about the specifics, is point out some of those specific things that the FBI just immediately should not be doing anymore.
Well, let me take that down. Let's talk just very briefly now the timeline of the FBI, and I've just got a layman's knowledge of this, but it came out shortly after the turn of the century, I think, and they were chasing around unions and communists mostly. J. Edgar Hoover got involved. Boy, was he a strange cat. I mean, this guy was going around pointing a finger at everybody's morality and their personal behaviors and stuff, and he was one of the weirdest people to ever be in Washington, D.C. And they started chasing around like I mentioned, Eugene Debs is where it kind of started. But then the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement. I've got this article that I clipped of what they did to M.L. King as an example. I can bring this up on screen. This is out of the Associated Press. This was a movie that came out, a documentary, which you may have seen. The opening images of the documentary MLK/FBI includes footage from the 1963 March on the Washington Mall that today is all more striking for the protesters' peacefulness. The march culminated in one of the most indelible moments of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And as familiar as the scene is, it could hardly stand in starker contrast to the recent U.S. Capitol riot. Here's a mass of humanity assembled at the nonviolent spirit of the movement's leader. Yet only 2 days later, on August 28, 1963, the FBI's head of domestic intelligence, William C. Sullivan, sounded an internal alarm on King. We must mark him now as the most dangerous Negro in the future of this nation, Sullivan wrote in an FBI memo. Details have gradually emerged on the FBI's investigation, which was carried out with approval from Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. I was not aware of that. I mean, he's very highly thought of in my circles, but later with the support of President Lyndon B. Johnson as well. Some FBI documents have been released over the years, though much remains heavily redacted. MLK/FBI is based on the 1981 book, The FBI and Martin Luther King Jr. From Solo to Memphis by David Garrow, who won a Pulitzer Prize for his 1986 biography of King, Bearing the Cross. Okay, let's bring that off screen here and bring the doc back in. So this is where, I got my initial very negative opinions of the FBI, the anti-war movement, and then the civil rights stuff. I remember as a kid hearing that they stuck tape recorders or a bug under Dr. King's bed when he traveled about. They were trying to catch him in some picadillo and bring him down that way. They suggested that he kill himself. I mean, just horrific. And instead of changing the FBI, it just continued unabated to where we are today.
Yeah, I mean, there have been, some of the exploits of the period of the 1960s, came out in part because some activists burglarized an FBI office and uncovered the COINTELPRO files that laid out many of the dirty tricks, although not all, that were being undertaken, including, writing fake letters to people, accusing people of being police informants to sow dissension within movements, trying to get people caught up in honey trap schemes and all kinds of stuff, and open intimidation, wiretapping, all the rest. And so the Church Committee in the Senate undertook hearings and recommended some restrictions on FBI political policing, but these were very minor restrictions. And this all happens in so much secrecy that much of it was essentially ignored. And the FBI continued to keep separate, secret files on people. So by the 1980s, there's a whole focus on the environmental movement, Earth First and other groups. And of course, after 9/11, the whole way in which they trump up this war on terrorism by going after vulnerable people, trying to entrap them into these fantastical schemes that these people had no ability or intention of carrying out, to just make themselves look like they need more money for counterterrorism stuff.
These fantastical schemes. I wanted to ask you about that specifically. It has to do with these undercover agents that are embedded in these groups. And the question always is, are they, too dumb? Are they in on it? I mean, are they accelerating? Are they entrapping? What exactly are they doing? And I've had on my show Laurel Krauss. She's the sister of a young woman that was killed on the campus of Kent State. And she's always talking about the FBI being there, being proactive in that circumstance that led to those shootings. And she believes they were involved and they're responsible and they've been left off the hook. And I'm not so sure she isn't correct, particularly when you look at very recent history here with the governor of Michigan up there, Whitmer, and that FBI embedding up there and those guys running around supposedly going to kidnap her and all that type of thing. Where do you come down on that?
Yeah, I think so. We're talking about a couple of different things here. One
Yeah.
is the use of agents provocateur,
Yeah.
who go into groups or go into protests with the intention of creating discord and extremist kinds of actions, violence, etc. You had it. This is internationally, but you had it in the UK. Undercover police engaging in acts of arson, fathering children with activists. This is the kind of stuff that political policing devolves into when it's allowed to go unchecked. The other thing we're talking about here is the targeting of vulnerable individuals, setting them up to take a fall, to make it look like the FBI is solving these horrible terrorist plots. So you have people who are not intellectually or materially capable of carrying out terrorist attacks, who are misled, cajoled, enticed, manipulated into saying a few things on tape that suggest they're going along with this, and then out pop the cops and it's like you're guilty of terrorism. So you had this so-called Herald Square subway bombing plot where the young man involved, had an IQ of like 75, was unable to complete school. And when they started to say, okay, we're going to do this now, he's like, well, can I call my parents and make sure it's okay with them if I go do this? This was completely manufactured by the FBI.
So,
and then, of course, then they go on all the news stations saying how they foiled a plot, but they invented the plot.
Yeah, and I made up a long list of these things that they've been implicated in, like Kent State, as I mentioned, Ruby Ridge.
And the Whitmer thing, I think, is really important to talk about, and a lot of kudos to some folks in libertarian circles, et cetera, for drawing attention to this, because I think it uses exactly the same tactics we've seen at targeting left-wing groups and other groups. So this is part of a pattern, and it's definitely something that needs to be exposed.
Yeah, I wanted to talk briefly about the bad things, obviously, but supposedly some of the good things that they could have done that they weren't capable of, and this kind of comes down to the incapability of the FBI to do its job. It goes all the way back to my childhood with the assassination of John Kennedy, Dallas, Texas. There was an FBI bureau there. Oswald was known to them. Hell, he'd come to the bureau, the office, and threatened to blow the damn thing up just like a week or two before Kennedy was killed. I think they knew where he worked. They knew that he had immigrated, that he had gone to the Soviet Union and they'd thrown him out because he was a nut, basically. They did nothing. The guy was in the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository while the presidential motorcade is going by. It's like, what the hell? What are you guys doing? Hosty, the FBI agent in charge of Oswald, burned his notes, flushed them down a toilet to prevent being found out that they knew all about this guy. And I'm also reminded, and this has kind of been swept under the rug in the annals of history, the Stoneman Douglas, the Parkland shootings down there in high school. down there in Florida. They had a phone call. They were tipped off in detail that this shooter was plotting, that he was planning, and they did nothing. And my God, look what happened. So
they had
what do you?
data
Yeah,
on 9/11. They
yes,
knew about the flight schools that some of the individuals had been pointed out to them.
yes. So I, and that goes to this issue that you were talking about with transparency. Now, supporters of the FBI themselves would say, well, yeah, you know all the bad stuff. My God, there's a lot of it, but you don't know the good stuff. Why? Because it's secret. We can't tell you. It's hidden from view. Is there any good stuff to be known? I mean, is there any
Well,
counterbalance
look,
here at
I'm
all?
sure, I'm
Yeah.
sure there has been a case here or there that they stopped someone from doing something bad. But we have to put it in perspective, right? We have to also think about what the costs are of this undertaking. What is it that we lose in the process? So, did they perhaps save a few lives in some undertaking? But in the process, we've unleashed an institution that's fundamentally eroded our democracy, eroded our freedoms, and also contributed directly to people's deaths. So the law enforcement interventions are not this, all positive thing. They come with costs. And also, we just grossly overestimate their effectiveness. We watch too many TV shows
Yes.
where the cops solve every crime and
Thanks for
prevent
saying
every
that.
bad
Yeah.
thing from happening and always get the right guy. And this is just myth making. This is not reality. Police solve very little crime. Most crime isn't even reported to them, and the crimes that are reported are not solved. They're not particularly effective at anything that they do. Um, and then we just pour more resources into it, and then we get mass incarceration, 1,000 police killings a year, huge racial disparities in the outcomes, et cetera. So we have to calculate those costs in. And then the last thing we need to do, which maybe we'll talk a little bit about, is we've got to look at what we could do differently, because there are lots of other things we could be doing. This is not the only possible tool to address the things that have been turned over to them.
Yeah, Dr. Vitale, thanks for mentioning that because I talk about that all the time on my show, how we have been influenced, hypnotized by Hollywood and television. And you think about the major professions that were shown on television serials and movies back in the day. I mean, we're talking about the medical profession, we're talking about cops, we're talking about lawyers. Um, we're talking about the FBI as an example of Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. My God, I used to watch that every night as a kid. I mean, that has a huge influence on us. And if you don't think
The
so,
Untouchables.
yeah, my God, we elected Ronald Reagan. I mean, a guy that was an actor, B actor, not a very good one, as president of the
Trump.
United
I
States,
mean,
and
I
Trump
think Trump
himself,
got
yeah,
elected because of his TV persona.
game show host with a bad comb over. My God, he got elected president of the United States. So let me bring this up because, as he mentioned, we've got some things here. Now, I want to get to this. Again, in Truth Out, before we run out of time here, Dr. Vitale, these are your potential solutions here, and we'll spin through these very quickly. There are four of them, but the first one is to help us all is to end the FBI's role in political policing. There's a long history of this, and it's bad. It's all bad.
Yes, I mean, really, this work should not be going on. This is politically motivated. It has fallen overwhelmingly disproportionately on left movements. It has
Yes.
been motivated by a history of racism and rabid anti communism. And it is not consistent with any kind of real robust democracy.
And you talked about the COINTELPRO in the 1970s, the Church Committee. Um, that's all part of this. Now, this is a little harder to read, so I'm going to read into this. And the FBI's role in the war on terror. This isn't talked about as much as it probably should be. One of the primary tools in waging this war has been the entrapment of people who are lured into fanatical plots, fantastical plots invented by the FBI agents, which we talked about earlier. But this war on terror I think about George Bush and all that type of thing. We don't think about the fact that the FBI is an integral key component of this, maybe the leading investigative agency, and this war is still being fought. We think about it being fought overseas, but it's mostly domestic, it seems to me like.
Well, we should start with repealing the Patriot Act. I mean, that would be a
Yes.
good place to start. And then I think as part of that, we need to look at these joint terrorism task forces and fusion centers, which suck up hundreds of millions of dollars and produce nothing in the way of public safety, and have mostly become a tool for enhancing surveillance and predictive policing that targets mostly poor minority communities.
And the FBI is growing. It has it ever shrunk? I mean, if you looked at its trend line, I think it's onward and upward for the FBI. It's still growing today, correct?
That's right.
My God. All right, so let's bring this next one up on screen here, see if I can get this my technology to help me here a little bit. And the FBI's role in the war on drugs. I have Matthew Ho on regularly. He's a regular guest on podcast by George. He's a Green Party candidate running in North Carolina. This is a big issue with him. It's been a big issue for a lot of politicians. It gets, some talk, but there's very little action on this. But the war on drugs, Gerald Posner was just on. He wrote the book Pharma. My God, the negative impact that this has had on our country. And again, this is something that's ongoing. There are people now that even want to accelerate the war on drugs. They really want to get after it.
Look, the war on drugs has always been a political project that has nothing to do with public health or public safety. It's completely illegitimate and unjust. And we should end the FBI's role in this. We should abolish the Drug Enforcement Agency. I've written about this previously for The Nation. And so we got to look to groups like the Drug Policy Alliance that propose very concrete public health and public safety strategies to help us deal with the very real problems that can be associated with problematic drug use, and turn this over to public health authorities. Other countries are moving in this direction. Portugal has decriminalized all drugs, made it a public health matter. I was there earlier this summer. They're very happy with the results, and they're trying to convince others to follow their lead. Voters in Oregon, have voted to move in a similar direction, and we're still in the implementation phase there, but I think it holds a lot of promise.
I didn't even think about that. I was thinking about Portland in particular. You're talking about Marjorie Taylor Greene earlier. Everybody was all for the FBI and the goons jumping out of these SUVs up in Portland, unmarked. A lot of them not wearing logos or anything like that. Again, the FBI was involved in that, right?
That's right. That's right. And the Marshal Service and other federal law enforcement.
It was hard to tell because they were not clearly identified, and that was not by accident, folks. That was by design. So let's get to number 4 here. In the FBI's role in so-called violence reduction. Okay, so what's violence reduction?
So what we've seen is that, what we think of as serious crime, violent crime, has historically always been a state matter. Homicide is a state crime that's handled by local police and state courts. The FBI has been a tool that presidents and others and attorney generals have been able to use to insert themselves into the national conversation about crime. It has not been a tool for solving crime, reducing crime. It has been a tool for political grandstanding. And we saw this most clearly in the last presidential election, where President Trump, in a kind of desperate effort to, surround himself in this tough on crime politics, created Operation Relentless Pursuit, later renamed Operation Legend, that was used to flood Democratic cities with federal law enforcement and money for more local policing, as a way of saying the problems of urban America are not disinvestment, or not globalization, or not deindustrialization, or not federal budget cuts. No, the problem is gangbangers and cartels, and the solution is not investing in opportunities, economic development, education. No, the solution is flood those communities with more police, and arrest everybody we can arrest.
Oh God! All right, I want to read this. I want to bring this up because again the podcast is heard in audio, obviously, so a lot of people can't read along with this. But this is a great summation. I mean, this is a great writing. You say these 4 steps would dramatically shrink the scope and power of the FBI and pave the way toward abolishing an agency that has not provided real justice or protection for large segments of U.S. society. As right-wingers make a bizarre and twisted case for defunding the FBI, we on the left need to make our own case for defunding the FBI's intrusive and illegitimate political policing. Then we must go further and question the basic function of federal law enforcement in propping up a system of profound inequality, injustice, and state violence. And I highlighted this up here again because it's talking about what the left can do. I also wanted to ask you about there are people that believe that we don't need this type of federal enforcement at all, that it can be handled on a state or a local level. But this goes back to maybe one of my first questions about be careful what you wish for here. You need some oversight or something because these state and local law enforcement agencies can run amok, and supposedly we need this back check on the federal level for that. Again, now, where do you come down on that?
Right. I mean, where is the evidence that the FBI has played that role in some positive sense? Right. I mean, I don't see any such evidence. Even the Department of Justice, which is most immediately tasked with this kind of oversight, they can bring these pattern and practice cases, et cetera, where there's just no evidence that this produces more justice for people, that this creates safer communities, that this transforms approaches to public safety. It's just the evidence is not there. This is just about providing cover, providing the illusion of oversight, the illusion of accountability, so that these systems can continue to go on functioning with public support.
Well, we are out of time here. I wanted to start off here at about 45 minutes or so. We have to be respectful of Dr. Vitale's time. The last question that I had, the Breathe Act. Now, I hear about this sometimes as a possible mitigation or solution. I think Ariana Presley has that going in the Progressive Caucus. But, I mean, they've been proven to be highly ineffective in Congress. It's like the Squad and the Progressive Caucus don't have each other's phone numbers, and I don't think they know the other Democrats in Congress at all because they can't get together collectively and get anything done. But the question is the Breathe Act just a step in the right direction, or is it the direction?
Well, I think it's the direction, but I think we also have to understand the political dynamics in Washington, right? We have a handful of Congress members who I think have the right idea, but they are a small minority within a deeply conservative party that's in a battle with an even more conservative party. The good news is that most issues around law enforcement are really local. And there's a lot we could do at the local level. And there are amazing struggles underway all across the country about shifting priorities out of law enforcement. Dozens of cities have eliminated their school police departments. Dozens of cities are creating non-police mental health crisis response teams. Dozens of cities are investing in community-based nonviolent strategies as an alternative to policing. And I think that's really where we need to focus our energy right now, not on Congress.
Well, we're out of time, as I mentioned, and we'll get him back. I'm going to ask him back anyway. I hope that he does. But I want to give you, the last word here, Dr. Vitale. Anything in closing on this particular topic that you want to talk about? Either maybe the most immediate situation down in Arkansas or this overarching issue with policing in America.
Well, in a way, I'm glad that the Arkansas thing is getting attention. I was on the PBS NewsHour last night with a chance to talk about this, but we got to keep in mind that this is not an aberration, that this is really what policing looks like, and the solution to this has to be less policing. And the other thing I wish I had added to the Truth Out piece was that we need to get the FBI out of the sex work business. The SESTA-FOSTA Act that further criminalized sex work and the websites that sex workers use to reduce their risk of violence and exploitation, the FBI's role here has been completely negative. They're not rescuing, people. They're interfering with the lives of very vulnerable populations through more criminalization. And so that's another area that they should be removed from.
Well, that's great. And again, thanks for your time. I really appreciate it. We'll circle back here very shortly. Dr. Alex S. Vitale, thanks again for coming on this podcast by George Live Line.
You're welcome, George.
And folks, if you like podcasts by George, if you like seeing guests like Dr. Vitale and getting this insight that you're not going to get in a lot of other places, although I got to admit, he does get around. He was on the news hour on PBS just last night. But please watch us, support Podcast by George by subscribing. Really, that's all you have to do. It's free. Go to podcastbygeorge.com and pick a platform. You can go on Facebook to get the videos, also on YouTube. Just subscribe there, ring the notification bell, give us a thumbs up on the platforms. Or if you like the audio only versions, maybe that's where you're listening today, you can pick that as well. Pick out iTunes or Spotify, the iHeartRadio app, Deezer, Stitcher, all kinds of places like that. Just click the little button. It'll take you to their sites and you can sign up there. But that is going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is. And there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.